So, Daphne Preuss, CEO of CarbonBook, thank you so much for joining me on the Vertical Farming podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
We were chatting a bit, as most folks do here in the Midwest, about the weather prior to getting started. So, for the benefit of the listener, where's home for you right now?
For me, it's in Maine, along the coast of Maine.
Yeah. Were you born and raised there?
No, no, I came from Colorado originally,
Okay.
in a farming community.
What's been the biggest difference for you going from Colorado to Maine, or is there anything you miss?
Oh, the climate is so different.
Yeah.
The part of Colorado I grew up in was quite dry, and
Yeah.
here we've got enough water, for growing trees and forests and things. It did teach me at a very early age the importance of water for agriculture and the
Mm,
huge limitations we're facing if we don't manage fresh water appropriately.
yeah. Makes sense. What city in Maine?
No city. I live in a
Okay.
town of 100 people. So
Wow.
the opposite. And just before this, we were living in Chicago for about 25 years. So the contrast could not be bigger.
What would you say you love most about where you are now then?
The outdoors, the wildlife,
Yeah.
it's a great place for thinking, for planning and writing, and it's been really refreshing to get out of the chaos for a while.
Yeah. You mentioned thinking and writing, which is something I think about when, for the benefit of the listener, I'm up north in northern Minnesota and at a cabin, which on camera probably looks like I'm in a sauna right now, but there's lots of wood paneling all around, and I always think about being in quiet places to do some writing. Is that something you try to find time for when you can?
I do, yeah. It's
Yeah.
um, it's a nice change of pace.
Yeah. And so I was doing a bit of homework on your background and looking at your history as, after you finished your university studies. And it seems like the world of agriculture and where you ended up at Carbon Book probably wouldn't be a surprise to anyone who's been following your journey for all these years. But can you talk a
Right,
little bit
right.
about, we'll make our way to current time, but I always like hearing a little bit about origin stories and
Sure.
how you got your
Yeah.
start in this field.
Well, as I said, I grew up in an agricultural community, so agriculture was always very close to my background, my early experiences. When it was time for college, I focused on science and
Yeah,
became a geneticist. For a while, I was pursuing that in an academic space. So went to graduate school at MIT and then Stanford, and then took a faculty role at the University of Chicago. And while I was there, I was focused on plants and pollination and understanding the mechanisms of how. But after a while, was frustrated that I wasn't having an impact on people's lives beyond teaching and training students. And so
yeah,
spun out a company while I was in the university, and that became focused on an outdoor crop, sorghum, which we developed, we innovated in that crop, and then we grew a seed distribution business out of that and sold product around the world. So we got to know the situation that farmers were going, their challenges with producing crops, with climate change, and all of the issues going on in global agriculture. After that business sold, I focused in on CarbonBook, and we've been
yeah,
looking at indoor agriculture. So
yeah.
that's been an interesting transition.
I also noticed you were doing some work with the New West Genetics as well,
Yes,
and
yes.
then you also had some experience with early experience with AI, and then looking at some of the remote sensing stuff as well, which I thought was interesting.
Absolutely. Well, Since the journey of founding my own business, and that I've also found it really interesting and exciting to help other entrepreneurs who are going through that same process. So I'm on the board of directors at New West Genetics, as well as a couple other boards of companies focused in agriculture. And I often say it's really rewarding to help new founders avoid the mistakes I made over the years.
Yeah.
The first time you do something, it's always a learning experience. And so, it's really exciting to see all the business ideas that are coming out lately in agriculture. I mean, it's a period of tremendous growth. I think there's a lot of amazing innovation, and the kind of innovations that used to happen only in large companies are now possible as costs have come down and technology has made everything easier. With regard to AI and software, I also was a partner in a company that made a software for biologists. We sold that company, so that was a SaaS business. Ended up with 600,000 users worldwide. So we grew that from start to sale. And so that, along with that experience, along with the work in agriculture, came together at CarbonBook. And we had some technology for thinking about how crops grow and using AI for that. Pulled all of that together into our current product.
It sounds from just your background that there's definitely an entrepreneurial streak in you, and and I'm wondering how far back that goes, and if that's something that you've always had this passion for starting companies.
Yeah, absolutely. My parents were entrepreneurs, and so that definitely was a big impact. I used to say that summer vacation and after school program was their business, and that's really the way they handled it with us. We learned everything from a very early age growing up in that family, and then I always was encouraged to do business activities even as a youngster. So you sell greeting cards or whatever it was, to earn a little bit of extra money and understand how business worked. And my parents were very good at training me, and just go get a bank account, balance your checkbook every month, even as like a preteen even. So it was very early being exposed to that way of thinking. And so I'd say, unlike a lot of academics or scientists, I had the basics of, how a basic business operates. And that really did help me as I thought about bringing, science into the business world.
Yeah. That experience is extremely helpful, being an entrepreneur myself, and I think if you don't have that experience, you'll learn the lessons, but you'll learn them the hard way, and you'll learn about them because you'll make the mistakes, you'll fall on your face, and then you'll figure out, don't do it that way instead. And it's nice to know that you had the support of your parents to help you with probably some of the mistakes they made in the past to make sure that those weren't repeated with your business ventures.
Right. Well, and so much of it is knowing what you don't know, right? And then knowing how to find the right expertise in someone else, and being able to tell the difference between someone who really knows their stuff and someone who doesn't. So it's very hard to absorb all of that.
So I know when you think about which one of your ventures is the most memorable from an inception starting point, a lot of times it's like asking a parent, about who's their favorite child, and obviously a lot of the focus is on CarbonBook. But when you think about how you go about starting a company and what you experienced before, can you put us in that mindset of where you were in 2019 when the idea started to flower for CarbonBook, and what your thought process was at that time?
Right. Well, As I said, I've spent most of my years in agriculture, and what was really starting to become very clear in 2019 was that climate change was here. We had been hearing about it for a long time, but we were really starting to see real impacts. Also, that water is one of the key limitations to agriculture. I mentioned that earlier. But you could really see that playing out worldwide with droughts and global issues. So I was excited about the idea of indoor farming as a way of really managing in places that were water limiting. And I think it is one of the ways that we can have a very important solution to that problem. If you think about does the Middle East grow the crops it needs to feed itself, something with indoor farming could really be an important answer. So those things were playing out in my mind, but also then thinking about how do you build an economy that gears everyone toward doing better in terms of carbon emissions, and how do you empower and enable all of these businesses to do that? And having worked with a lot of farmers and also getting to know indoor farmers, you appreciate that their days are very full and they're very packed with simply trying to get the job done. Get crop grown, to get the right yield, to get the right pricing, to keep the business running. And so I could see that industry and that group of people would be asked to report on their carbon emissions, and they don't necessarily have the expertise in-house to do that. It's a big pain in the neck to do that rigorously. You've got to do it in a science-based way. And it's very important for the consumers of that kind of information that there are uniform standards, that things are reported accurately. So it felt to me like we needed to help people, to empower people to be able to get the information they needed, to be able to relay that to stakeholders. And so just coming off the heels of having built and sold a software business, it seemed to me that a simple tool that has a great user interface and is easy for people to use, doesn't take a lot of their time, could help them do what they needed to do, but also move the industry toward a more beneficial direction and use less carbon. Because I really think the industry has potential for a huge impact on agriculture. As I said, water is an issue, but also reducing fertilizer use, reducing pesticide use, all of those great things about it. But one of the, unpleasant parts that we don't all talk about is if you look at the industry as a whole, it consumes a lot of power, which means it has a really big carbon footprint. And, and other aspects of it also are feeding into carbon emissions. So I'd like to see the industry really thrive and succeed. Compared to outdoor farming, it's not as good on carbon, and we need to help it get better. So I know that's a long, complicated answer, but it was kind of the synthesis of climate change, carbon intensity, empowering people to do something in a very easy way and hopefully make the industry thrive.
Can you talk a little bit about how you've seen the indoor farming, the sector mature over the years? I imagine when you started in 2019, I don't know how much of the business was focused on indoor farming, what percentage of that, and how that shifted based on how you've seen the maturity happen over these past few years.
Well, we've always been focused only on indoor farming. I would say that early on there was huge exuberance for indoor farming, vertical farming especially, lots of money being thrown at it. I think as it's matured now, we've seen some of those businesses operate successfully and some of them really struggle. So today, reality is hitting people in the face, I think. It's also true that consumers love the products. and that's been borne out. There's no doubt that people will really, buy this kind of produce. It's better tasting, it's fresher, it looks great. No problem with sales. But doing it in an economically successful way has been challenging for some groups. And there was a lot of exuberance. I think, that's been the case a lot of times. For the greenhouse, the broader greenhouse space, they've gone through consolidation. There are some operators who have done extremely well. I think the bigger conglomerates do better. There's a lot of thinking about logistics, where to locate, all of those things going into it. But I think it's an industry that's here to stay, and it's got a good growth rate. I also have seen the input providers really mature over this time. So great innovation in lighting, in fertilizer, substrates for growing, seeds, seed breeding, all of those things are really making a healthy ecosystem, for the indoor farmers.
For the benefit of folks who are not familiar with CarbonBook, can you talk a little bit about the offering? Who is an ideal client? And then what's their experience? Maybe a little bit about, from like who this is a good fit for, what that onboarding looks like, and if there's a process for getting them online, just so people have an idea of the scope of work that you provide.
Sure. I would say that for companies that want to market themselves as having a sustainability focus, or alternatively for companies that are hearing from their customers that the customers want to report on carbon from their supply chain. Those are our ideal customers. Those are the people who are coming to us. Either, they're wanting to promote themselves or they're under some pressure. And we also have customers in Europe where the pressure is coming from regulatory. But here in the US, it's mostly a, customer-driven. Large retailer wants to have some numbers, and how do I provide that? The tool takes about 30 minutes a month to enter the data. And in fact, much of the data can be entered by the account. So a grower doesn't have to think of this as a big draw on their time. We've used principles. There's a very deep discipline called human-computer interaction, HCI. Okay. And we've used those principles to make the software very intuitive. So most people can sit down in front of it, and on the first try, they know exactly what to do. There's very simple drop-down menus. Once you set up, then month to month, it's to keep going. You can use the information from the prior month and just tweak what changes. And it covers all of the inputs of your facility. So not just power use, but water use, fertilizer, substrate, materials, covers transportation. Okay. So, did you drive to the store? Did you ship the product to a warehouse? All those aspects. And then while you're doing that, it shows a report with bar graphs. Where is your biggest carbon emission coming from? And you can see how that's the different aspects of the business are contributing to that. It also accounts for beneficial things you do, like maybe you recycle, you compost your biomass waste, you use a renewable source of power, you've negotiated with a power company for a power purchase agreement. All of those things positives are in there as well. And at the end of it, there's a score for how much carbon per pound or ton or kilogram of produce. And so you can see how you're doing. And then it also allows benchmarking. So you can see how you compare to other indoor farms. Are you in the bottom quartile? Are you in the top 10%? And that gives you a sense of, what you might need to do better.
And I imagine it's similar sized farms when you're doing that comparison.
Not yet, not today. We're building the
Okay.
database, and I think as we get more and more people on board, it will make sense to parse it in different ways. But yeah, we basically look at carbon per kilogram of produce
Okay.
because as retail, and this is already happening, retail is starting to label products on the shelf with how much
Yeah.
carbon is embedded in making that product. So when the
Yeah.
consumer looks at one tomato versus another tomato, they're just going to see a number, how much carbon. And it's not really going to matter to them if it came from a small facility or a big facility or an outdoor farm or an indoor farm. It's just literally how
Yeah.
much carbon. And so that's where we're reporting.
Are you seeing any movement when you mention that, the thing that comes to mind is how people see labels like natural and organic and how that's influencing their buying decisions. And I'm wondering if we're moving towards, the carbon footprint label or some sexier
Yeah.
identification, and how, from a marketing perspective, the challenge is to let the consumer know that that's something that they should be looking out for as well.
Yeah, well, that's already in stores. So I'd encourage you as you buy things, you'll see some leading companies starting to report on this.
Yeah.
And, we saw recently, several others jumping on board. So PepsiCo, Nestle, Unilever.
Hmm.
Unilever says
Yeah.
75,000 products will be labeled soon. And so
Wow.
whether the industry wants to or not, there will be labels. And also, I think people might be aware, but just to mention that for the large publicly traded companies now, the SEC is going to have, starting in 2024, a requirement that you report on carbon. And
Hmm.
it's going to
Yeah.
be an accounting standard. It needs to be based in substance. So it can't be
Yeah.
greenwashing or just, happy talk. It has to be really solid. And
Yeah.
so this is coming. I think this is going to, surprise a lot of people when, 2024 is not very far away.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you're going to have to report your score, good or bad.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
your customer will need to have that if they're a public company.
You mentioned the likes of Unilever, and I'm wondering how you see those partnerships with your large input providers. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, well, we see ourselves as helping those big companies that have to do reporting, whether it's to regulators
Yeah.
or, financial markets or other things. And many of them, as you probably know, have set very aggressive carbon reduction goals for themselves. So we see ourselves as helping them collect the data,
Yeah.
and they want to help their suppliers do better. So it isn't
Yeah.
just about policing or collecting information. They'd like to be able to say to a group of suppliers, hey, this is a situation where maybe there's room for improvement, or
Yeah.
maybe incentivize them to improve. Like, if you can get your carbon footprint down by 5%, we'd be happy to pay you a premium. And I
Hmm.
think that a lot of the largest companies are really motivated to do that. They,
Yeah.
as I said, they set aggressive goals, and they've spent the last few years trying to get their internal operations to be better. They've kind of exhausted what they can do there. They've worked very much with the power grid to do the best they can there. And now the only
Yeah.
place to go is to look at their supplier network. And in many cases, of the goals they set, only about 20% can be met with what they've already done. So the rest of it, the 80% that's left, has to come from the suppliers. And so they are looking
Hmm.
top to bottom at every single supplier and helping, often smaller companies do better.
I couldn't help but think, as people were going through this process and entering all their inputs into the system, um, there may be some cases where they're surprised at the output that comes out of there, and I'm wondering if, from some of the clients that you've worked with, as they start to put in all the different factors that might affect their carbon footprint, Are there some things that are really surprising to them where they're, they didn't realize what that impact was?
I suppose energy often is one of those that people really,
Yeah.
they know that this is a big expense for the business. They know they're using a lot of power, but when they see it laid out there as
Yeah.
big of a contributor it is. And so the good side of that is just a little improvement in energy use efficiency. Maybe it's about changing lighting from incandescents to LEDs, ways, combined heat and power generation, various things that they can do. They can have a
Yeah.
huge lasting change on their carbon emissions, which, by the way, also in many places qualifies them to collect carbon credits. So they get paid back for that. So
Yeah.
this is a situation where there's a lot of incentives for people to get back.
I've noticed you talked a little bit about on the site about the collaboration you have with U.S. National Renewable Energy Lab and the Danforth Center, and I'm wondering how those relationships came about and how that's helped the work that you're doing at CarbonBook.
Well, we won a competition. It was a grant competition sponsored by Wells Fargo and the Danforth Center and NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab. The competition was focused on indoor farming and innovation in that area. We were the only one that is doing what we're doing on carbon footprint. We worked with the Danforth Center, which has a lot of research greenhouses, to help develop our tool. And we went from concept to launch product during the time of the grant. So we progressed really fast through their program. The NREL collaboration is also really interesting. This is one of the DOE, Department of Energy. They're in Golden, Colorado. And they've really specialized in building materials and construction. And so what we're doing with them is thinking about how the choice of materials for greenhouses, for indoor farms, can have more or less embedded carbon in that. And then in addition, how changing ways of operating can affect carbon footprint. So for example, if in a greenhouse, do you use shading to alter lighting, and things like that can have a big impact.
So that begs the question as to how early in the process can a flow like this help a new farm? Because you're talking about building materials, a lot of times they may not give those the proper consideration, to your point, that they should be.
That's right. So there's two kinds of considerations when you're standing up a new facility. First, the embedded carbon in the materials you use. And that will be calculated, over the lifetime of those materials. So it's sort of amortized, if you will, over time. But then the choices you make will affect your day-to-day carbon footprint. And there are choices you can make that will minimize it, and choices you make that will, maximize it. And so probably very good to do some scenario building before you really, make those selections.
Yeah. I noticed also that you were selected as one of the top 5 agritech startups in Canada and also most innovative Canada-based agtech companies. And I'm wondering how that process came about.
Yeah, well, the original founders of the company started in Quebec. They were a team of AI folks, and then I joined shortly after that to build out the carbon footprint part. But they were based in Montreal, and so we've kept the company there, although I'm based in the U.S. I think it's been beneficial to us to have a working footprint in both countries. It gives us a more international feel. And we have had incoming customers and clients from all around the world. And as you probably are aware, when it comes to climate and carbon, there are many countries who are actually out in front of the US in terms of adoption of policies and standards and regulations. So we've always taken a global view to this problem.
We were chatting prior to recording about how you were at Indoor Icon the company was at Indoor Icon
Yes.
last year, and we'll both be there again this year. Um, how how many years have you been going to these conferences? And I'm wondering if you've seen the dynamic of the companies that attend or the experiences and the conversations you're having at these conferences, how they're evolving over the years.
Well, not a lot of years, really,
Yeah,
because we were getting started on this in 2019. And
yeah,
then within months of getting started, the pandemic happened. And
yeah.
we were all under a travel freeze, if you recall. And
Oh, yeah,
particularly a Canadian-based company, we could not cross the border and attend events in the US. So that was okay though, because for a couple of years we just hunkered down and did software coding, and we needed to do that. And so last year, 2022 was actually our first rollout at the Indoor Icon.
okay,
Great event, great reception. We had a booth. We
yeah,
had a lot of people that came, and
yeah,
there a lot of folks were saying, haven't thought much about this yet. Haven't thought a lot about, measured my carbon footprint.
yeah,
So that conversation's evolved now. And, I'd say that people are kind of in two camps. There are those who are embracing, the new world of reporting on carbon, which is
yeah.
absolutely happening. And then there are those who are really hoping it doesn't happen for so they're trying to, avoid it. But I really don't think it can be avoided.
Yeah, it feels like burying your head in the sand moments if you're not
It does.
confronting the realities of where we're headed from a climate
Yes.
change perspective.
Yes.
Um, do you look at the broader picture a lot in terms of climate change? I'm assuming that's something you follow fairly closely, and I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about, where we're headed, even outside of the indoor ag tech world, and anything that we can. I know that Carbon Book is doing your part to help people realize the scope of the problem, but I'm wondering if there's
Yeah.
anything in that field that is on your mind lately.
Well, agriculture broadly is a huge contributor to carbon
Yeah,
emissions, but it also can be a very important solution. And
hmm,
I've been really interested and excited to see the advances in research over the recent years. People understanding how soil health can really
yeah,
affect carbon capture. Um, Rethinking fertilizer use, because fertilizer is one of those things that contributes to um, nitrogen emissions, and those are equivalent to greenhouse gas effects.
yeah,
So, that industry is going through a huge change as it reevaluates its carbon. And a lot of that pressure, again, is coming from the largest consumer companies like, those who manufacture foods we eat day to day.
yeah,
They are now asking farmers to think very hard about their use of fuel, their use of fertilizer, the crops they grow, how they cultivate their land. And there's also, I find this to be a really interesting and promising area up. If you think about 10,000 years of human history and breeding crops, we've been mostly looking at the parts we see, the parts above ground. But people are
yeah,
realizing that there's a huge diversity in the root system, and that the depth and branching of roots can affect how much carbon goes to the soil. So there's now a
yeah.
huge new generation of breeders that are looking for roots and root structure. And I think we could really reshape our core crops to capture more carbon, which is really exciting.
Oh, that's
So,
exciting.
I know that's not answering about the whole world of carbon, but I tend to focus on
Yeah,
the agriculture side, which is probably about 20% of
yeah.
our carbon and climate change issues.
I'm assuming there's always a lot on your mind, and there's always new challenges when you get out of bed in the morning, and things that need to get done. But I'm just curious if there's a tough question you've had to ask yourself recently.
Well, I'd say like any startup CEO, it's the financial climate has been a little bit challenging in the last year for companies that are
Yeah,
raising capital. We're doing
yeah,
okay, but that's something. Cash should be on the mind of every startup CEO, honestly, and
yeah,
how you build
yeah,
your business and get it to where it needs to be. So that's one that's kind of there daily, and finding investors that really can believe in the vision you have, even before you're a large company and profitable. That's always a challenge for small companies.
yeah. I'm curious, given the experience you've had in your entrepreneurial journey and the companies you started and led previously, how have you grown and matured as a leader throughout the years?
Oh, that's a great question. I can say, looking back at myself 15 years ago, it's a little bit humbling and humiliating sometimes of thinking of all the things you didn't know. Um,
Yeah,
I think one, which may be surprising, stress level is down. There were a lot of things when you don't know what you're doing or you're doing it for the first time. There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of tension. It's so much easier if you've seen it before, so
yeah,
that's been very helpful. I would say just ability to present, communicate, talk about ideas, and an ability to kind of pace the information flow. That's really improved.
yeah,
It's hard for founders and innovators to convey their vision to people who've never heard it before. So
yeah,
that is always something that's a challenge, but I think I've gotten a bit better at that. Working with people, trying to hire the right people for the problem. I think that's been good experiences there, good learnings, and keeping a team motivated. And probably
hmm
that, a lot of times we think the most important thing in these businesses is the technology, but it's actually the people that are making the
yeah.
technology. So you really have to focus on that.
Has there been some experiences you've had with mentors previously that have been memorable and instrumental in your growth?
Oh yeah, I've been very lucky to have amazing mentors over the years, and those experiences, those relationships are just so valuable.
Yeah,
I kind of go back to the people who I worked with to learn science and rigor, and how
yeah,
important it is to have your credibility. They were amazing. And then on the business side, finding people that were willing to teach me what I didn't know and patient, to help me do that. Um,
yeah.
as I said, I was a scientist first and then a business person, and learning to communicate to those two audiences takes some effort. So had some wonderful mentors that helped with that.
Yeah, it's interesting to have the mix of both of those experiences because they're two completely different worlds, and I think it's
Yes.
been, I'm sure, invaluable for you to be able to bring those two together. And sometimes they speak completely different languages, I'm sure at times as well.
Yeah, I would say the language is different, but in a
Yeah.
lot of ways the objectives are similar. You're trying to do
Mm,
something that is a new breakthrough when it's in
yeah.
science, and similarly in business, you're
Yeah.
trying to have a new, especially entrepreneurial companies, you're trying to have something that is a breakthrough that's going to disrupt the current markets. That's going to,
Yeah.
be something that people are drawn to. So those objectives are similar. You fund them in different ways. In the scientific world, it's often nonprofit that funds government grants, things like that. But you still are pitching all the time, just like you do with companies. So it's a little bit of framing, a little bit of focusing on the ultimate currency. Instead of building publications, you're adding dollars to the company's account. But otherwise, I think there are a lot of parallels. And I would say, I see a lot of scientists be intimidated by the business world. I don't think they should be. I think they just need to talk to someone who's been there and done it, and they have all the skill set they need to function very well. It's just a matter of learning the language.
This might be a good episode to send any scientists in the future who are considering an entrepreneurial journey to get a taste of what your experience has been like.
We need more of them. We need more of them for sure. Yeah.
So Daphne, I like to leave some time at the end of these episodes. I've been doing this lately, and have you give you some space for any messages you have for folks within the vertical farming community, because as you know, there's a lot of your peers and colleagues that listen to this podcast, and folks that are in this space. So I've been just leaving some time for you if you have a message or anything you feel like you want to say to this community.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks for that opportunity. That's great. So I've touched on a little bit of this, but I just kind of reiterate. One, the world we live in, the economy we live in, the business situation is going to require carbon reporting. It absolutely is. Yeah. And if we pretend it's not going to happen, we're going to be left. So that's the first thing. The second is there's room for improvement. The industry does have, on average, a pretty healthy carbon footprint. I should say a pretty large carbon footprint, but some operations are running in a way that is reducing carbon footprint. So it's definitely a problem for the industry as a whole, but it's solvable. So we're at a moment in time here where the vertical farming industry could really take a leadership role as a group and say, hey, we're committed to having a healthy environment, not just sustainability in terms of water use or pesticide use or fertilizer use, but also carbon emissions. And we want to be the leaders in that. I think if they remain silent or not, stepping up, then it could be that they get steamrolled by others carrying a message that's negative and not what they'd like to have. Now, we recently saw a coalition of several vertical farms coming out to talk about, strong sustainability goals. And I think that's just wonderful progress. That sends a great message. But that kind of leadership is needed. And, a lot of times when you're within an industry, you're thinking about your competition is the other vertical farm next door and how you want to position is better than them. That's not what's needed here in this carbon. Because I think what will happen more likely is that consumers will compare vertical farming to historic outdoor in terms of carbon. And when they see that tomato on the grocery shelf, it's going to be which one looks nicer, which one tastes better, but has a different carbon score, and how much does it cost? And the consumer is going to integrate all those factors and figure out what they want to buy. And unfortunately, I think if the tomato is 10 times more carbon because it was grown in a vertical farm, there are a bunch of consumers who will say, I'm not buying that. Or if it tastes better, I don't care if it looks better. I'm just not doing it. And we're seeing that borne out in cases where particularly younger consumers even if it causes some margin. So I think that the industry needs to think of itself as an industry, and because I think that's how the consumers will look at it. And leaders need to step up and be having very positive messages and teaching others how to reduce carbon, not keep it all secretive, you know. So that would be my hope for.
It sounds like you'll be having many more of those conversations in a couple of days at Indoor EdCon. So I want to thank you for taking the time to come on and share your inspiring story, especially you don't see a lot of folks coming from the science background and with as much entrepreneurial and business experience as you have. And I think a lot of that has been borne out in what you've been able to do at CarbonBook. So I appreciate you sharing a bit of your background as well and sharing your story.
Harry, and thank you for all you're doing for the vertical community, and these podcasts are a great service to the whole community. So thank you.
I appreciate that.